Hi everyone. Last night the government rammed through a bill that will create more windfalls for corporate landlords and vulture funds, and more misery for people renting, homelessness, and more young people being forced into emigration. This was called the Residential Tenancies Amendment Bill 2026. And of course, they rammed it through in advance of the March the 1st deadline that they want this introduced by. It has to go now before the Shannon, and last night nearly 80 TDs voted in favour of this bill. Of course, it was the government and the Lowry-led lackeys that supported this bill for the big corporate landlords. Now, it's going to create major issues in our society. We've already seen the worsening housing disaster with record amounts of people who are homeless, record so-called sleeping on couches, and record amounts of immigration. Not to mention, on top of it, record amounts of immigration also that benefits the values that this government try and uphold. Of course, their rich friends across the world. Now, it's going to have an impact on new tenancies that are going to be created after March the 1st, in terms of landlords are going to push up rents towards the market prices. Now, of course, rents are completely extortionate as they are, but now the opportunity is to make massive windfalls, and the government will claim that this facilitates investment. And of course, those investors need certainty and a massive return on their investment. And they'll say that it's down to the Housing Commission that said we needed so much private investment. Well, the Housing Commission that was set up in 2021 and reported back in 2024 had a lot of property industry lobbyists on board. Surprise, surprise. Big developer like Michael O'Flynn was on board with the Housing Commission. Of course, a representative from Goodbody stockbrokers who benefit from the housing disaster. Ronan Lyons, also of daft.ie, of course, who benefit from the housing chaos. And of course, the Senior Counsel on Property Rights was part of this Housing Commission with other architects as well, who are assured to make massive money from the designing of these massive developments that are being forced on the people of Ireland, such as the build to rent phenomenon, which has come in since essentially the financial crash, where it opened the door to all the vulture funds, and we've seen the havoc that they've caused in people's lives. But this has been ramped up on massive amounts of steroids. Now, today I'm up at Lorcan O'Toole Park in Dublin, a famous GA ground here on the south side of Dublin City in Crumlin. And in the distance there you can see a gym. That's the Ben Dunn gym. It used to be the Carlisle grounds. And just looking at this side of it here would be the gap, is where a big development is going in. And this development is going to accommodate over 208 apartments. Of course, 104 one-bed apartments and 104 two-bed apartments. And of course, more built to rents. And who's going to benefit from this? Well, it's owned by a company called Terranure Land Limited. Interesting. But if you follow the trail of companies, it works its way back to Oak Tree Capital. Now, Oak Tree Capital, of course, are massive funders of the international protection system. Many companies have made money in Ireland through that immigration chaos and are making money, of course, through this build to rent, where it's going to force people into long-term unaffordability and ultimately homelessness if they can't afford to pay the extortionate rents. Upwards of €5,000 expected to be added to an average rental bill in Dublin, and much more in excess of that probably across the country in terms of percentages increases. Now, this is also owned, Oak Tree Capital has recently been purchased by Brookfield Asset Management. They have currently around $1 trillion in assets. They're a private equity company. Of course, they're facilitate from many crises and manufacture crises. And interestingly enough, on the board of that company was none other than Mark Carney, now the Prime Minister of Canada, former head of the English Bank of England, and of course has an Irish passport, I understand, as well. Now, he was on the board of Brookfield Asset Management, and he was involved in pushing through the net zero agenda through that organisation and the transition in terms of sustainable development goals. Interesting, isn't it? Of course, World Economic Forum isn't far from what's taking place in Irish society. and they would make massive windfalls from those apartments, which would be rented across the football pitch, hurling pitch here in Crumlin. Now, it's outrageous because formerly the Carlow Grounds was a sports ground, and for years and years it was used as a soccer, football, rugby, the whole different kinds of sports were played on it. But of course now is an opportunity to make massive windfalls, build up to 6-story apartments, charge people absolutely through the nose around this, and make massive windfalls for the billionaires and the private equity companies. And of course, where does the money go? You can follow it all to their political connections, can't you? And if so, they might decide to sell to perhaps an approved housing body, which might come on the agenda in the not too distant future. And I'm sure massive more windfalls will be pushed out of Ireland towards Brookfield Asset Management and these massive private equity corporations, of course, which the Irish government benefit from. So this is a big part of the freedom of movement of capital. And of course, with the freedom of movement of capital, you need the freedom of movement of labour. Hence, we have the mass immigration chaos as well. So essentially, the young Irish people around this area, Crumlin and further afield, will not be able to afford to live in their own communities. These will be priced completely out of their reach and no opportunity even to buy those homes. But of course, this is what the government facilitate. And of course, you can follow your road to the World Economic Forum and what their agenda is as well. So thanks so much for the support today. Really appreciate it. With my videos, thanks for everybody who shares my videos, hypes them, and thanks for everybody who continues to comment as well. So from Crumlin today, and the